picture yourself standing right in the dead center of modern Seoul today.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you are just surrounded by the absolute bleeding edge of the 21st century. We're talking towering skyscrapers completely wrapped in glass, massive digital billboards flashing high-definition K-pop idols, and just this relentless, hyper-fast, futuristic metropolis that frankly feels like it's operating 10 years ahead of the rest of the world.
Right, it's incredibly fast-paced.
Exactly. But then you turn a corner, and right there in the middle of all the neon and the concrete is Gyeongbokgung.
Quite the contrast.
It really is. It's this massive, sweeping, centuries-old palace complex, you know, with its curved, painted wooden roofs and these vast stone courtyards. It is just a stunning visual collision, like a sudden drop into the ancient past.
Yeah, and it's important to realize it's not just a tourist trap or a pretty backdrop for your photos.
Right.
That palace is the physical anchor to a single family that ruled this nation for 505 years.
Which is just insane to think about.
It really is.
So welcome to today's deep dive into the source material, where we are taking you into the incredible, bloody, brilliant, and honestly, ultimately tragic story of the Joseon Dynasty.
And I think we really need to emphasize the sheer timeline we are dealing with here, because it is staggering. 5 centuries of continuous rule by a single family, which is the House of Yi.
Yeah.
Just to put that in perspective for you, the Joseon Dynasty actually outlasted the Ming Dynasty in China.
Wow.
It lasted almost twice as long as the Qing Dynasty, too. I mean, it spanned the era from the European Middle Ages all the way to the dawn of the First World War.
That is a massive chunk of human history.
It is. It's the architectural, cultural, and social bedrock of modern Korea. You really cannot understand the modern Korean peninsula, its language, its social norms, its geopolitical anxieties without understanding Kyosit.
Which is exactly our mission today. We are taking the massive stack of source material we've gathered, and we're going to dissect the central historical tension of the House of Yi. We really want to know how they seized power, how they constructed this supposedly unshakable legitimacy to hold on to it for half a millennium, and, what ultimately brought this monumental dynasty crashing down into the 20th century.
Right. And to do this justice, we need to look at this history through a couple of distinct analytical lenses.
Because it's too big otherwise.
Exactly. So I'll be focusing heavily on the mechanics of power, the institutional frameworks, the geopolitical strategies, and specifically how the founders used philosophy, not just as a belief system, but as a really rigid operating system for state control. We'll be looking at the blueprints of the state.
And I am explicitly claiming the lens of the human element. Hey, I like the drama. The visceral family drama, the deep cultural legacy, the symbolism, and really the emotional toll all of this took on the people actually living inside that system. Because, when you strip away the grand titles and the golden robes, you're looking at a family.
Right, a very powerful family.
And families are messy, they're paranoid, and fiercely protective. Okay, let's unpack this by transitioning from the glowing legacy of modern Seoul right back into the blood and mud of the 14th century. Because the first question we really have to answer is fundamentally about theft.
Theft on a massive scale.
Yeah, like how do you justify stealing a 500-year-old kingdom?
Well, you start by looking at the geopolitical crisis that actually made the theft possible.
Right.
So we are in the year 1388.
Okay.
The existing Korean state is the Goryeo Dynasty.
Mm.
Now, they have been in power for nearly 500 years themselves, which is an incredible run. But Goryeo is crumbling.
It's falling apart.
Exactly. For decades, they've been heavily dominated by and intermarried with the Mongol Empire. But by this point, the Mongols are receding, and the new Ming Dynasty is rapidly rising in China.
So a massive power shift.
Right. The geopolitical tectonic plates are just shifting violently. And the new Ming emperor sends a decree essentially demanding that Goryeo surrender a massive chunk of its northern territories.
Which you can't just agree to.
You can't. So in response, the dying Goryeo court makes this desperate, perhaps completely suicidal calculation. They order their top military commander, a brilliant tactician named General Yi Sung-gi, to march an army north and attack Ming China.
Which, okay, that just sounds like an absolute disaster waiting to happen.
It really was.
I mean, you don't just march against the newly minted, massive Ming Empire unless you have, like, a death wish or a severe detachment from reality.
Well, the good news for his men was that General Yi Sung-gi was entirely attached to reality. He completely understands the logistics of this. So he marches his army of about 50,000 men as far as Wiwa Island on the Yalu River, which is the border between Korea and China.
Okay, so they make it to the border.
They do, but it is the monsoon season, The river is swollen, the mud is deep, and disease is rapidly breaking out in the camp.
Oh, miserable conditions.
Terrible. General Yi just pauses. He realizes that crossing that river to attack the Ming is a complete fool's errand. It will destroy his army, and subsequently, it will leave his country totally defenseless.
So what does he do?
He drafts a petition to the Goryeo king, outlining 4 highly logical reasons why the invasion is doomed, including the weather and the massive disparity in military strength.
And let me guess, the king listens reasonably and calls them back.
Not quite. The king rejects the petition and orders him to advance anyway.
Wow. So General Yi is just trapped. It's either advance and die or retreat and commit treason.
Yeah, and he chooses treason. In a move that honestly changes East Asian history forever, he turns his entire army around at Wiwa Island. He marches right back south to his own capital, Gaegyeong, and launches a full military coup.
He just brings the whole army home.
He breaches the city gates, defeats the loyalist forces, and overthrows his own bosses.
He deposes the king. But you know what's fascinating is that he doesn't actually take the throne immediately, which is a really interesting psychological move when you think about it.
It's very calculated.
Yeah, he puts a puppet on the throne for a few years just to kind of handle the transition, eliminates his political rivals one by one, and finally, in 1392, he officially takes the throne himself. He becomes King Taiho.
Right.
But here is where it gets really interesting to me. You can't just say, hey, I have the biggest army, so I'm in charge now, and expect that to just last for 5 centuries.
No, that is a recipe for endless civil war.
Exactly. You need a rebrand. You desperately need to construct legitimacy from scratch so the peasants and the scholars actually believe you have a genuine, divine right to rule.
And the search for that validation becomes his primary obsession. General Yi lacks royal blood. He is from a military family on the northeastern frontier, so he immediately looks for historical and international backing.
Where does he start?
First, he seeks endorsement from the very Ming Dynasty he was just supposed to attack.
Oh, that's bold.
It is. He sends envoys to the Ming emperor, essentially saying, hey, the old regime that wanted to attack you, they're gone. I am your loyal servant.
We're cool now.
Basically, yeah. By voluntarily entering their diplomatic sphere, he seeks their official recognition to cement his domestic position. Second, in 1393, he renames the entire state. He drops the name Goryeo entirely.
Right, and he revives an ancient, almost mythical name, the Suron. I love this detail because it feels so modern to me. It's exactly like a hostile corporate takeover.
How do you mean?
Well, a new CEO comes in, violently fires the entire board of directors, but to keep the shareholders from panicking and selling all their stock, they immediately rename the conglomerate to something deeply nostalgic and trustful.
Oh, I see.
By calling it Joseon, he is linking his brand new, bloody military regime to Joseon, which was the ancient Korean kingdom founded by the mythical figure Daegun thousands of years prior. It's brilliant marketing.
It really is.
The message is, we aren't a new dictatorship, we are a return to the golden age. And he also packs up the capital and moves it to Hanyang, which is modern-day Seoul, literally changing the geographical center of power.
It's a complete reset of the state's physical, psychological, and historical landscape. By moving to Seoul, which is protected by mountains and fed by the Han River, he physically distances his new government from the deeply entrenched aristocratic power bases of the old Goryeo capital.
Smart.
Very. But while King Taiho is managing the macro-level state building, the micro-level, his own family, is completely fracturing.
Oh, boy.
The newly formed House of Yi immediately plunges into a severe crisis of succession.
And the family drama here is pure, unadulterated Shakespeare. It is violently messy. It's known in the historical sources as the strife of princes.
Which is a very fitting title.
Totally. So King Taiho has several sons from 2 different wives. His 5th son, a guy named Yi Bangwan, is the guy who really got his hands dirty during the coup. He did all the heavy lifting. While his father was playing the noble general, Bangwan was the enforcer.
He was the one executing the dirty work.
Exactly. He orchestrated the assassinations of key Goryeo loyalists. Most famously, he had a revered scholar named Jung Mong-ju bludgeoned to death on a stone bridge. Bangwan did the really dark deeds to put his father on the throne, so naturally, Bangwan expects to be named crown prince.
You'd think that would be the reward.
Right. But Taiho, who is heavily influenced by his second favorite wife and his brilliant chief state counselor, a man named Zhang Dozhan, passes over Bangwan. He names his 8th son, a very young half-brother to Bangwan, as the heir.
And according to the sources, this was far more than just simple parental favoritism or sibling rivalry. The animosity between Yi Bangwan and the chief architect Jeongdojeon, represents a fundamental clash over the entire constitutional design of this new state.
How so?
We really need to look at what Jeongdojeon was actually trying to build. He was a visionary scholar who envisioned Joseon as a kingdom ruled primarily by appointed ministers.
Not the king.
Well, he wanted a meritocratic bureaucracy where the king was more of a moral figurehead, guided and constrained by his scholarly advisors. The king would reign, but the ministers would rule.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Yeah. Yi Bang-won, on the other hand, demanded an absolute monarchy. He believed the royal family, specifically him, should wield total, direct, unquestionable power. Jeongdojeon saw Bang-won as a highly dangerous warlord and even tried to abolish the private armies held by the princes to solidify bureaucratic control over the military.
Which was just the ultimate red line for Bang-won. I mean, you don't take a warlord's private army away and expect him to just nod and retire to the countryside.
Definitely not.
So in 1398, while his father is mourning the sudden death of his favorite wife, Yi Bang-won strikes. He launches a preemptive raid right into the palace. He tracks down the chief architect Jeongdojeon and slaughters him.
A brutal turning point.
But he doesn't stop with the politicians, right? He murders his 2 young half-brothers, including the crown prince. It is a visceral, bloody massacre of his own flesh and blood. King Tayo is so horrified, so psychologically broken by the sight of his own sons killing each other, that he actually abdicates the throne in disgust and just leaves the capital.
And this initiates a brief period of extreme volatility. Now, Bang-won is smart enough not to take the throne immediately. It would look too much like a bald-faced usurpation.
Right, the optics are bad.
Exactly. So he puts his older brother on the throne temporarily as King Jeongjeon, essentially using him as a seat warmer to let public outrage cool down.
Yeah.
There is even a second strife of princes in 1400 when another brother tries to launch a counter-coup.
Because of course there is.
But Bang-won's military forces easily defeat him. Bang-won exiles that brother, forces the seat-warmer king to abdicate, and finally takes the throne for himself, officially becoming King Taejong.
And I really have to push back on King Taejong here based on the primary sources, because when you look at them, the man was a ruthless, paranoid tyrant.
Well, he was severe.
Severe. He murdered his brothers. He murdered the founding philosopher of the state. Once he was finally king, he executed the brothers of his own wife, his in-laws, just to make sure they couldn't threaten his power.
He was a very violent purge, yes.
Decades later, he even forced the father-in-law of his own son to commit suicide. He is running a literal masterclass in paranoia, wiping out anyone who shares a dinner table with the royal family.
The body count is absolutely undeniable, but I think we have to evaluate the mechanics of statecraft here. I have to respectfully disagree with the label of mere tyrant, which kind of implies violence just for the sake of ego or cruelty.
You don't think it was ego?
Was he brutal? Absolutely. But his brutality was a highly calculated institutional necessity.
Okay, I understand.
Taejong was performing the violent surgery required to centralize a state that was literally born out of a military coup. Think about it. His father set the precedent that a general with a private army could overthrow the government.
Right, which is a dangerous precedent.
Exactly. By eliminating the private armies of the aristocracy, Taejong ensured no one could ever repeat his father's actions. By eliminating his powerful in-laws, he protected the throne from the exact kind of external family manipulation that had plagued and ultimately destroyed the previous Goryeo dynasty.
Okay, so you're saying he was basically the designated monster. He did all the terrible, unforgivable things so his successors wouldn't have to worry about looking over their shoulders every 5 minutes.
That is a very accurate way to frame it, actually. And look at his administrative reforms once the threats were neutralized. He didn't just kill, he built.
What did he build?
He established the state council, requiring all major decisions to flow directly through the king, cementing the absolute monarchy he fought for. He launched a massive nationwide survey of land ownership and population. By uncovering hidden lands and populations that the aristocrats were keeping off the books to avoid taxes, he effectively doubled the state's revenue overnight.
Wow, doubled it.
He even set up the Sinmun office, placing a really large drum outside the palace. It was an institutional mechanism where commoners who felt exploited by the aristocracy could beat the drum and petition the king directly. Taejong's ruthless centralization really built the unshakable, fully funded foundation that made the subsequent Golden Age possible.
Okay, that is a fair point. You really can't argue with the administrative results. He paved the road with bone, but that road did lead directly to the reign of his son, who would become arguably the most beloved king in Korean history.
King Sejong.
Right. But Taejong's reign also highlights a massive structural problem for the dynasty. Once Taejong secured absolute power through this massive wave of blood, the House of Yi couldn't just keep murdering everyone for 500 years to stay in charge.
No, violence is exhausting.
And it's expensive. They needed something sustainable. They needed a software update for the entire culture to make people actually want to obey.
And that software update was Neo-Confucianism, specifically the Chengzu school of Neo-Confucianism. And we really have to dive into what this actually means, because it wasn't simply a religion adopted for spiritual comfort.
No, it was intense.
It was a comprehensive, totalizing ideology deployed as a direct tool for extreme social control and statecraft. Standard Confucianism, which had been around for centuries, was largely about ethics and how to behave in society. But Chengzu Neo-Confucianism, which was synthesized by scholars in China, added a massive layer of metaphysics and cosmology.
So they took practical, everyday ethics and literally tied it to the physics of the universe.
Precisely. The Chengzu school argued that the entire universe is governed by Li, which is principle, and Qi, which is material force. Everything has a fundamental principle. The principle of a father is to lead. The principle of a son is to obey. The principle of a king is to rule justly. The principle of a subject is unquestioning loyalty. Therefore, if you disobey the king or disrespect your father, you aren't just breaking a local law, you are violating the fundamental physical laws of the universe. It elevated social hierarchy into cosmic truth.
Which is an incredibly powerful tool for a new dynasty trying to solidify its grip. If rebelling against the king is the equivalent of trying to reverse gravity, you have created a very, very compliant society.
Exactly.
But to install this new operating system, they had to delete the old one. The previous Goryeo dynasty was deeply, profoundly Buddhist. Buddhism had been the state religion for nearly a millennium. They had massive wealth, huge temple estates, and a ton of political power.
And to build a new power structure, they systematically dismantled that old one. The Joseon founders marginalized Buddhism with just ruthless efficiency. They confiscated massive tracts of tax-exempt monastic land and absorbed it directly into the state.
Hit them in the wallet.
Exactly. They reduced the number of legally recognized monasteries from thousands down to just a few hundred. They even banned Buddhist monks from entering the capital city of Seoul entirely, forcing them into the mountains.
Wow, just banned from the city.
The philosophical justification was laid out by the very man Yi Bangwan murdered, Jeong Dojon. He wrote a famous, really scathing text called Anti-Buddhist Polemics. He argued that Buddhism was otherworldly, selfish, and parasitic, encouraging people to abandon their families for personal enlightenment. Neo-Confucianism, he argued, was about practical reality, social duty, family, and state service.
But, the cultural fallout from this whole software update was profound, and frankly, on a human level, it was utterly tragic for half the population. When you look at the sources regarding gender roles, the shift is staggering.
It was a massive regression.
Yeah. In the previous Goryeo era, women actually had considerable freedom and status. They could inherit property equally with their brothers, they moved relatively freely in society, and families often lived with the wife's parents after marriage. But this new, rigid Neo-Confucian system demanded a strictly patriarchal, male-dominated society built on filial piety and absolute propriety.
The societal shift engineered by the state was extreme, and it was meticulously enforced. Women were suddenly expected to be silent, to be completely segregated from men who weren't immediate relatives. The state aggressively promoted the idea of the virtuous woman.
And it went so far that the concept of female chastity became a literal matter of life and death for a family's political standing. The historical sources note that young noble girls were actually expected to carry a small ornamental knife called a paido.
Right.
If they were attacked, or honestly, even if there was a credible rumor of an affair that might bring dishonor to the family, they were expected to use that knife to take their own lives.
It's horrific.
It is. And the state would give awards to families of women who committed suicide to preserve their chastity. Widows, regardless of how young they were when their husbands died, were legally and socially banned from remarrying. And if they did, their children were barred from ever taking the civil service exams. Women completely lost their inheritance rights. The entire social fabric was reorganized into these rigid, unyielding hierarchies.
Because it was a system utterly obsessed with classification and order, not just by gender, but by class. And this brings us to the mechanics of how the government actually functioned. The Goryeo system, or the civil service examinations. To rule this highly structured society, the kings formed an uneasy, symbiotic alliance with a class of people called the Yangban.
The scholar officials, right? The ruling elite.
Yes, the Yangban were the civil and military bureaucrats. Now, in theory, Joseon was a meritocracy. To get a government post, you couldn't just inherit it. You had to pass a grueling, multi-tiered series of exams based on memorizing and interpreting vast, massive volumes of Confucian classics.
Which sounds fair on paper.
On paper, anyone could take the test. But in practice, the reality was entirely different. To pass these impossibly difficult exams, you needed decades of expensive tutors and immense leisure time just to study.
Resources only the wealthy landowners had.
Exactly. Consequently, the Yangban quickly evolved into a closed, hereditary nobility.
So the king had absolute authority on paper, but he really needed the Yangban to actually run the ministries, collect the taxes, and draft the laws.
Right. And the Yangban constantly used their mastery of Confucian morality to check the king's power. They would hold these massive protests, kneel in the courtyards, and refuse to eat until the king reversed a policy they deemed un-Confucian. It was a perpetual, highly ritualized balancing act between royal absolutism and bureaucratic pushback.
And the absolute zenith of this cultural and political balancing act happens under King Sejong the Great, who takes the throne in 1418. Sejong is the son of Taejong, the ruthless centralizer we just talked about.
Yes, he inherited a very stable state.
Right. And because his dad had already eliminated all the political threats, Sejong gets to be the visionary. He doesn't have to look over his shoulder. He pours state resources into science, agriculture, and literature. But his undisputed masterpiece, the thing that makes him a legend, happens in 1443 and is officially published in 1446.
The creation and promulgation of Hangul, the native Korean alphabet.
Yes. And I'm just obsessed with the mechanics of this achievement. Up until this point, if you wanted to read or write in Korea, you had to use classical Chinese characters Hanja, which means memorizing tens of thousands of complex logograms.
It takes years and years of intense study to master.
Exactly. It meant only the elite, the really wealthy Yangban, could read. If a commoner was wrong, they couldn't even read the laws to defend themselves. But Sejong personally directs the creation of a brand new, purely phonetic alphabet designed specifically for the unique sounds of the Korean language. And the design is a marvel of scientific and cosmological thinking.
The physical architecture of the letters themselves is just brilliant.
It really is. The consonants are actually shaped to mimic the physical positions of your vocal organs when you make the sound. Like the labial sounds, like M and B, they look like closed lips or a mouth. The velar sounds, like K, actually show the physical shape of the tongue blocking the back of the throat.
It's phonetic precision.
And the vowels are based on a Neo-Confucian cosmological triad. There's a round dot representing heaven, a horizontal line representing the flat earth, and a vertical line representing the human standing between them. You combine them to make every sound. It is so logically perfect that modern linguists still marvel at it as one of the most rationally designed writing systems in human history.
And what's fascinating here is not just the linguistic achievement, but the political genius behind Hangul. We often look at it purely as a cultural milestone. I mean, the original promulgation document, the Hunmin Jeondeom, is literally a UNESCO memory of the world.
Yeah.
But think about the power dynamic we just discussed. By creating a script so simple that a common peasant could learn it in a matter of days, Sejong was effectively bypassing the elite monopoly on knowledge.
Oh, and the elites hated it.
The Yangban fiercely resisted it. Prominent scholars like Cho Munri submitted blistering petitions to the king, arguing that abandoning Chinese characters was tantamount to abandoning civilization itself and basically sinking to the level of barbarians.
They were terrified of losing their edge.
Exactly. By giving the common people a voice and a tool for literacy, Sejong was subtly undermining the informational control of the very aristocrats who constantly challenged royal authority.
It is brilliant statecraft disguised as a gift to the people. But, despite this massive push for Confucian rigidity and this top-down cultural engineering, the sources point out something really fascinating about how the older indigenous culture survived. Shamanism, or Muzhou, which predates both Buddhism and Confucianism, it didn't just vanish because the state said it was unscientific. It survived in the shadows, and crucially, it was largely preserved by women.
That's right.
The female shamans, the Mudang, continued to perform complex rituals and gut ceremonies to heal illnesses, bring rain, and guide the dead. Even within the palace walls, royal concubines and queens sometimes secretly patronized them. While the men were obsessing over rigid Confucian texts in the main halls, these women were preserving ancient spiritual agency right beneath the surface of the state.
That tension between the official, rigid state ideology and the practical reality of human belief is a really recurring theme in Joseon. And speaking of official state ideology, if we're discussing the mechanisms of power, we absolutely have to talk about how they enforced accountability at the very top.
The record keeping.
The sheer obsession with record keeping.
Yes. The Joseon Sillok, the veritable records of the Joseon Dynasty. To set the stage for how intense this was, there is a famous anecdote about a Joseon king, and it was actually King Taejong himself who is out hunting. He falls off his horse.
Right.
He immediately stands up, dusts himself off, looks at his entourage in an absolute panic, and says, "Let no one tell the historians." Because he knows they write down everything.
Everything.
And what do the historians do? They write down that the king fell off his horse, and they also explicitly write down that he begged them not to record it.
It perfectly illustrates the incredible institutional power of the historian class. The Sillok is perhaps the most incredible documentary achievement of any pre-modern state in world history.
It's massive.
We're talking about 1,893 volumes covering 472 years of daily entries. They recorded royal audiences, philosophical debates, the weather, diplomatic meetings, factional disputes, nearly 50 million Chinese characters of raw data.
Just an unfathomable amount of information.
But its true significance was structural. How was it made? Every single day, low-ranking historians sat in the corner of the royal chambers, writing down the sacho, the draft notes of everything said and done. After a king died, a dedicated history office compiled these drafts, along with secretarial daybooks, into the final official record.
And here's the kicker. To ensure absolute objectivity, there was a strict, unbreakable rule. The reigning king was forbidden from reading the records of his own father's reign.
Exactly. It acted as an institutional check on absolute power. You are the absolute monarch, but you cannot edit, censor, or even view the historical judgment being passed on your predecessor.
It's brilliant.
A king knew that his every action, every temper tantrum, every brilliant policy would be scrutinized by history, and he couldn't alter the draft. To protect these records from fire and war, they were copied and stored in highly fortified remote mountain archives across the country. It was an ideology that literally worshipped history as the ultimate judge of legitimacy.
So if we take a step back, we have a dynasty that has centralized its military, updated its cultural software to a strict Neo-Confucian hierarchy, allied with a powerful bureaucratic elite, and instituted massive historical accountability. They are incredibly solid internally.
Very solid.
But as you and I know, internal stability is completely useless if a much bigger, much stronger neighbor decides they want to crush you. How did Joseon survive for centuries sitting right next door to the massive, aggressive Ming Empire?
By engaging in a highly ritualized, incredibly pragmatic diplomatic dance known as Sade.
Sade translates roughly to serving the great, right?
Yes. The Joseon founders voluntarily and enthusiastically entered the imperial Chinese tributary system. We have to understand that in the deeply hierarchical worldview of East Asia at the time, there was no concept of sovereign equality like we have in international law today.
There was no UN.
Right, there was no United Nations where every country gets one vote. China was viewed as the moral, cultural, and political center of the universe. Joseon accepted the position as the most favored tributary state. They cast themselves as the loyal younger brother to Ming China's father.
So it's that family hierarchy again.
Exactly, mapped onto geopolitics. They adopted Ming reign dates for official documents, the Joseon kings accepted formal investiture from the Ming emperor, and they sent multiple massive tribute missions to Beijing every single year.
Wait, okay, let's unpack this, because to a modern ear, they just willingly handed over their sovereignty. This sounds incredibly humiliating.
I can see why you'd say that.
I mean, it sounds like a small business paying protection money to the mafia so their shop doesn't burn down. Like, here's your annual tribute of horses and gold. Please don't invade us.
I understand why it looks that way through a modern lens, but if we connect this to the bigger picture of East Asian statecraft, it was really less mafia extortion and much more a masterstroke of political realism.
Okay, defend it.
Yes, it was ritually subservient. The envoys had to physically bow to the emperor. But what did Joseon actually get in return? First, complete domestic sovereignty.
Really?
Yes. The Ming emperors did not interfere with Joseon's internal politics, its laws, its taxation, or its culture. Joseon ruled itself entirely. Second, the tribute missions were essentially highly lucrative, state-sponsored, free trade caravans.
So they were actually making money off this subservience.
Highly profitable money. Under the Confucian logic of the system, China, as the magnanimous father, was culturally obligated to bestow return gifts of much higher value than the tribute Joseon brought.
Oh, that's clever.
Joseon would bring horses and paper, and the Ming would send back massive quantities of luxury silk, silver, and rare medicines. And most importantly, Sedo provided an ironclad mutual defense pact. By being a loyal younger brother, Joseon secured the ultimate military umbrella of the Ming Empire.
Which means they didn't have to bankrupt themselves building a massive military.
Exactly. This allowed Joseon to maintain a relatively small border army, saving immense state resources. It was a pragmatic, contractual relationship that, over centuries, eventually evolved into genuine ideological loyalty. The Joseon elites began to view the Ming not just as a military protector, but as the true, radiant center of civilized Confucian morality.
A mutual defense pact that is going to be put to the ultimate, most violent test imaginable. Because at the end of the 16th century, that isolationist peace shatters. We are moving into the crucible of invasions. This is the major turning point for the dynasty, where everything they built is pushed to the absolute breaking point.
The Imjin War. From 1592 to 1598, Joseon faces an existential threat, and surprisingly, it doesn't come from the north. It comes from the south across the sea, Japan.
Right, so Toyotomi Hideyoshi has just unified Japan through relentless, brutal civil warfare. He now has a massive, battle-hardened army of samurai and eshigaru with no one left to fight, which is a very dangerous thing for a dictator to have.
A restless army is a threat.
So he sets his sights on an insane goal, conquering Ming China. He sends envoys to Joseon demanding that they grant his armies safe passage through the Korean peninsula to get to China. Joseon, fiercely loyal to their Ming father, absolutely refuses.
Naturally.
So Hideyoshi invades, and the devastation is almost beyond comprehension. We are talking about an initial invasion force of over 150,000 Japanese troops pouring into the peninsula in a matter of weeks.
We have to look at the mechanics of why the invasion was so initially devastating. Joseon was completely unprepared for the reality of modern warfare. They had enjoyed 200 years of relative peace.
Right, they hadn't fought a real war in generations.
Their military was structured around repelling small pirate raids or nomadic incursions using cavalry and traditional bows. But the Japanese army arrived equipped with Portuguese-style matchlock muskets, arquebuses.
Gun.
Yes. The Joseon infantry, fighting with spears and bows, were decimated by organized, rotating volley fire from these new firearms. Within weeks, the Japanese forces had marched all the way up the peninsula and captured Seoul. King Seonjo was forced to abandon the capital and flee north of the Ming border in the freezing rain, an act that completely shattered the public's faith in the monarchy.
And the demographic and cultural catastrophe is staggering. Estimates suggest Joseon lost between 20 to 30% of its entire population to combat, starvation, and disease.
It's apocalyptic.
To put that in perspective, losing 30% of your population is a scale of loss that rivals the worst plagues and world wars in human history. The cultural destruction was just as thorough. Gyeongbokgung, the magnificent royal palace we talked about at the very beginning, was burned to the ground, many say, by angry Korean peasants who felt abandoned by the fleeing king.
Which highlights the breakdown of that Confucian loyalty.
Absolutely. And remember those remote mountain archives holding the precious Sillok historical records. 3 of the 4 archives were discovered by Japanese troops and destroyed. If not for the survival of a single archive in Jeonju, centuries of meticulously recorded history would have vanished in smoke forever.
And then there was the targeted cultural theft. This wasn't just a military invasion, it was an extraction of human capital. The Japanese forces engaged in the forced deportation of tens of thousands of Korean artisans, scholars, and technicians.
Ceramicists.
Exactly.
Joseon white porcelain, the baekja, was highly prized across East Asia for its minimalist, pure Confucian aesthetic. It was notoriously difficult to make, requiring extremely high firing temperatures. Entire villages of Korean potters were kidnapped at sword point and dragged across the sea to Japan.
It's tragic.
These enslaved artisans essentially founded the major Japanese ceramic traditions that Japan later became world famous for. It was a massive transfer of cultural wealth through violence.
The dynasty only survived total annihilation because of 2 factors. First, the Ming dynasty honored that Sedo Defense Pact. Recognizing that if Korea fell, China was next, the Ming emperor sent massive land armies to assist Joseon.
They actually showed up.
They did. Second, the unparalleled brilliance of Korean naval commanders, most notably Admiral Yi Sun-sin. While the land armies were collapsing, Admiral Yi commanded the seas.
We absolutely have to mention the turtle ships. Admiral Yu utilized the Jeobukseon, heavily modified Korean warships. They took the standard, sturdy Korean hull, covered the top with a curved wooden roof covered in iron spikes so the Japanese couldn't board them, and packed them with cannons.
Very innovative.
Admiral Yi used his intimate knowledge of the coastal tides to lure the Japanese fleets into narrow straits and utterly annihilated their supply lines. The Japanese troops in northern Korea literally starved because their resupply ships were sitting at the bottom of the ocean.
The war finally ended in 1598 when Toyotomi Hideyoshi died of natural causes and the Japanese armies retreated. But Joseon was left a smoldering ruin. The agricultural base was destroyed, the population was decimated, and the state was completely bankrupt.
And tragically, they didn't even get time to fully rebuild, because just a few decades later, the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted again.
A massive shift.
The Ming Dynasty, their protector, the center of their universe, starts to collapse under attacks from the Jurchen people in Manchuria. The Jurchens unite, rename themselves the Manchu, and establish a new dynasty, the Qing. And they look down at Joseon and say, you need to break ties with the dying Ming and submit to us as your new overlords.
Which puts Joseon in an impossible geopolitical and moral position.
Right.
The Ming saved them during the Japanese invasions at massive cost themselves.
Hmm.
Joseon's loyalty, rooted in strict Confucian principles of filial piety and gratitude, is entirely to the Ming. Furthermore, the Qing are viewed ethnically and culturally as unlettered barbarians.
And militarily.
But the reality is that the Qing are militarily vastly superior. The new Joseon king Injo stubbornly tries to maintain support for the Ming. In response, in 1627 and again in massive force in 1636, the Qing cavalry invades Joseon. The Korean defenses, which were still wrecked from the Japanese War, collapse rapidly.
And it ends in absolute historic humiliation. Qin Injo flees to the Namhan Sunsong Fortress, the South Han Mountain Fortress. He is besieged in the dead of winter. His men are freezing to death. They are eating their horses.
We were completely outmatched.
Finally, realizing resistance is futile, King Injo is forced out of his fortress. He walks into the Qing military camp, and in the freezing snow, he is forced to perform the highest act of submission. He bows his head to the dirt 9 times before the Qing Emperor, formally severing ties with the Ming, handing over his sons as hostages, and becoming a tributary to the Manchus.
This singular event creates a profound, almost paralyzing psychological trauma within the Joseon Line.
I can imagine.
To the Korean Neo-Confucian scholars, the Ming represented civilization itself, the center of universal order. When the Ming finally fell entirely to the Qing in 1644, Joseon suffered a massive crisis of identity. The barbarians had conquered the center of the world.
So what does this all mean for their worldview? I mean, if civilization just died, who are they? What is their purpose?
Their answer to that existential question was a fascinating ideological pivot known as Sojunghwa, or the Little China ideology.
Little China.
Yes. The Joseon intellectuals collectively decided that if the physical center of the civilized world had been overrun and corrupted by barbarians, then Joseon was the last remaining bastion of true, pure Confucian civilization. They were the sole inheritors of the moral mandate.
Oh, wow. So they doubled down.
It's exactly. Long after they officially submitted to the Qing diplomatically, Korean intellectuals secretly maintained Ming reign dates in their private writings. They wore Ming-style clothing, and they held secret memorial services for deceased Ming emperors. They doubled down on their own cultural superiority as a psychological defense mechanism against their undeniable military inferiority.
It is a fascinating coping mechanism. Like, you may have beaten us, but we are morally superior. But this intense ideological pressure cooker, this obsession with philosophical purity, caused the Joseon court to fracture internally.
Very deeply.
You had intense factionalism. The scholar officials split into groups, initially the Easterners and Westerners, which later fractured into the Northerners, Southerners, Noron, and Soron factions. And we need to make it clear, these weren't just political parties debating tax rates. They were deeply divided along philosophical lines regarding the mechanics of Neo-Confucian rituals.
And we should look at the mechanics of these debates to understand why they were so deadly. And obviously, we're just looking at the historical records of these ideologies impartially here.
Right, of course.
They were known as the Yesong disputes, or ritual controversies. For example, in 1659, King Heong dies. His stepmother, Queen Jangreol, outlives him. The court erupted into a literal life-or-death debate over how long the queen mother should wear mourning clothes.
Really?
Yes. One faction argued for 3 years, another argued for 1 year.
Which sounds incredibly trivial to us today, like who cares how long she wears mourning clothes? But it was actually a debate about constitutional law, wasn't it?
Precisely. King Heejung was the second son. Under strict Confucian ritual law, a mother mourns a firstborn son for 3 years and a second son for 1 year.
Okay, I see where this is going.
By arguing for 1 year, one faction was implying the king was merely a second son, subtly undermining the legitimacy of the entire royal succession. By arguing for 3 years, the other faction asserted that by taking the throne, he became the spiritual firstborn.
That is wild.
These debates over ritual minutiae were proxies for power. If your faction lost the philosophical debate, you weren't just voted out of office, you were accused of heresy, exiled, or forced to drink poison. The court became completely paralyzed by charges of treason, bloody political purges, and endless generational cycles of revenge between these factions.
It is a classic symptom of a traumatized state turning inward. Instead of fighting external enemies, they cannibalize each other over philosophical purity. Joseon survived these two massive invasion periods, and remarkably, they managed to enter a nearly 200-year period of relative peace, strict isolationism. The borders were locked down.
Right, the Hermit Kingdom era.
But that trauma fundamentally broke something in the internal machinery of the state. The factionalism hollowed out the bureaucracy. It set the stage for a slow, terminal rot.
Which brings us to the 19th century decline. In 1800, King Jeongjo dies. Now, he is largely considered the last strong, effective monarch of the dynasty. He was a brilliant scholar who really tried to balance the warring factions, promote equal opportunity, and push for agricultural reforms.
A reformer.
But he dies suddenly, and he leaves behind a very young heir. And this kicks off a 60-year period of absolute institutional dysfunction known as Sedo Politics, or in-law government.
And this is where we see the fatal flaw of absolute monarchy. When your entire system, your entire constitutional architecture relies on a strong, capable king to balance the factions, and a child takes the throne, a massive power vacuum instantly forms.
Instantly.
And in the 19th century, that vacuum was filled by the Queen's family.
Specifically, the Andong Kim clan and later the Punjang-jo and Yohong Min clans. These royal in-laws entirely bypassed the traditional state councils. They took control of the Border Defense Council, which had morphed into the supreme organ of state, and they monopolized every single vital, lucrative position in the government.
Nepotism on steroids.
They handed out governorships and military commands to their cousins and uncles.
They completely hijacked the state apparatus. And remember the Guazhou exam system, the supposedly grueling, meritocratic civil service exams that kept the system running with brilliant scholars. Under Sedo Politics, it degraded into a blatantly corrupt pay-to-play scheme.
It was incredibly corrupt.
The mechanics of the corruption were brazen. Powerful families literally hired ghostwriters to take the tests for their sons. They bribed the graders. Sometimes they just forged the identities of the candidates entirely. High-ranking government posts were bought and sold for massive bribes on the open market.
While the kings were powerless.
Right. The kings sitting on the throne during this era were reduced to mere figureheads, isolated in the palace, completely unable to govern at all.
And while the aristocrats in Seoul were buying and selling offices to enrich themselves, the structural beams of the national economy were collapsing. The taxation system, known as the three policy system, broke down entirely under the weight of this corruption.
We really need to explain how this actually affected the common people, because this is where the human toll becomes unbearable. The three policy system had 3 pillars: the land tax, the military cloth tax, and the state grain loan system. The wealthy Yangban were largely exempt from the land tax, so the burden fell entirely on the peasant farmers. The military cloth tax required commoners to give bolts of cloth to support the military, but the corrupt magistrates, desperate to recoup the massive bribes they had paid to buy their jobs in the first place, started taxing infants and even dead people.
Which is just appalling.
It was a practice darkly called the white bone tax.
And the third pillar, the state grain loan system, or wongok, was originally designed as a social safety net. The government would lend grain to peasants in the spring during planting season, and the peasants would repay it with modest interest after the autumn harvest.
Sounds helpful in theory.
In theory, yes. But under Sedo Politics, it mutated into state-sponsored loan sharking. Magistrates forced peasants to take grain they didn't even need, often mixed with sand and chaff just to add weight, and demanded repayment at exorbitant, ruinous interest rates.
It is a devastating picture. The 19th century for the average Korean commoner was an absolute nightmare. You have severe famines caused by floods and droughts met with zero government relief. You have extreme grinding poverty. It's like termites in the walls of an ancient wooden house.
That's a good analogy.
From the outside, looking at the elaborate court rituals and the massive palaces, the Neo-Confucian facade looked perfectly intact. But inside, the structural beams were entirely hollowed out by corruption. There was no strength left.
And when people are systematically starved and exploited for decades, with absolutely no legal recourse, they revolt. The 19th century is punctuated by massive, desperate popular uprisings.
Like what?
The Hongyeonnai Rebellion in 1811 in the north, where peasants and fallen elites joined forces to protest regional discrimination. Then the massive, peninsula-wide peasant revolts of 1862. And ultimately, it culminates in the Donghak Peasant Revolution in 1894.
Donghak translates to Eastern Learning. It was a massive armed uprising driven by a fascinating new religious movement. Donghak combined elements of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, but its core tenet was radically egalitarian. They believed that the divine existed within every single human being.
A very dangerous idea to the elite.
Right. Therefore, all humans were inherently equal. They demanded an end to the corrupt Yangban class, an end to the crippling taxes, and they raised a massive peasant army. The Joseon state was so hollowed out, its military so completely neglected that it could no longer even police its own territory. They couldn't put down the rebellion on their own.
And this internal hollowing out happened at the exact worst moment in world history. Because while Joseon was collapsing inward, paralyzed by corruption and rebellion, the age of Western and modernized imperialism had arrived right at Korea's doorstep.
The worst possible timing.
The Hermit Kingdom, which had fiercely maintained its isolationist policy, refusing trade and diplomatic contact with Western powers, was about to be violently dragged onto the global stage.
Which brings us to the final collapse. For decades, Joseon had repelled French and American naval incursions. They really thought they could just keep the doors locked forever. But by the late 19th century, that was no longer tenable. And the threat didn't come from Europe, it came from their neighbor.
Japan.
Yeah. In 1876, Japan, having recently modernized, industrialized, and militarized during the Meiji Restoration, employed the exact same aggressive gunboat diplomacy that Western powers had used on them just a few decades earlier.
The Unyo incident.
Right. Following a staged naval skirmish, Japan anchored warships off the Korean coast and forced Joseon to sign the Treaty of Ganghwa.
It was a classic unequal treaty. It forced Joseon to open 3 ports to Japanese trade, and crucially, it granted Japanese citizens extraterritoriality, meaning Japanese citizens in Korea were exempt from Korean law. This breached the whole of Joseon's sovereignty entirely.
The floodgates open. Suddenly, it's not just Japan. Recognizing weakness, Russia, the United States, Britain, France, and a fading King China are all scrambling to sign treaties, secure trade rights, and basically carve out spheres of influence in Korea. The peninsula becomes this tense geopolitical chessboard.
The chaotic.
And right in the center of this storm, trying to navigate this impossible situation, is one of the most tragic, brilliant, and dramatic figures of the late dynasty, Queen Min, later known posthumously as Empress Myeongseong.
Queen Min was a brilliant, highly educated, and frankly ruthless political operator. While her husband, King Gojong, sat on the throne, she effectively became the true power in the court.
She was running the show.
She read extensively, studying history and international affairs. Her strategy for saving the state was essentially survival through triangulation. She recognized that Joseon was too weak to fight off these empires directly, so she tried to play them against each other.
How did that work?
Well, when the Japanese gained too much influence and tried to force pro-Japanese reforms, she aligned the court with King China. When the king became too demanding, she sought secret diplomatic ties with the Russian Empire to balance them out.
So she is trying to keep the wolves at bay by making them snarl at each other, trying to buy Joseon just a little bit more time to modernize on its own terms.
Exact.
But the Japanese government and military leaders realize that as long as Queen Min is in power, orchestrating this diplomatic resistance, they will never fully control the Korean peninsula. She is too smart and too effective at utilizing Russian influence. So in 1895, they make a terrifying move. In a shocking, unprecedented violation of sovereignty, Japanese military agents and hired ruffians infiltrate Gyeongbokgung Palace in the dead of night.
The only incident. They storm the royal quarters, cut down the royal guards, and specifically hunt for the queen.
They assassinate Queen Min. They murder her, desecrate her body, and burn her remains in the palace courtyard to destroy the evidence. It is a brutal, visceral end to the era. The queen of a 500-year-old dynasty, murdered by foreign agents inside her own bedroom.
It's a horrific event.
King Gojong and the crown prince are left terrified, basically hostages in their own palace, before eventually escaping to the Russian legation for safety.
The assassination of Queen Min really marked the point of no return for Korean political autonomy. The psychological blow to the nation was immense. In a desperate final move to assert independence and break free from the centuries-old tributary mindset, King Gojong returned from the Russian legation in 1897 and declared the creation of the Korean Empire.
Wait, an empire?
Yes, he elevated himself from king to the title of emperor. On paper, this placed him on theoretical equal footing with the emperors of Japan and China. He was declaring to the world that Korea was a sovereign, independent nation, subservient to absolutely no one.
And the new empire initiated the Gwangmu reforms, right? They made this frantic push to industrialize. They built modern schools, updated land ownership records to increase taxes, established a modern banking system, and even installed electricity and streetcars in Seoul, actually beating some European cities to the punch.
They did.
They had already passed the Gabo reforms a few years earlier in 1894, which fundamentally altered the DNA of the country by finally abolishing slavery, the rigid Yangban class system, and the ancient Wagyo civil service exams. They were trying to modernize centuries of tradition in a matter of years.
But despite the earnestness of the reforms, it was all simply too little too late. The illusion of a sovereign Korean empire couldn't stop the heavily industrialized modern war machine of the Japanese Empire.
No.
The geopolitical fate of Korea was sealed not in Seoul, but on the battlefields of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905. When Japan stunningly defeated Russia, the last foreign power capable of balancing Japanese ambition in Korea was removed.
The chessboard was cleared.
Yes. In 1905, Japan forced Korea to sign a protectorate treaty, stripping the nation of its diplomatic rights entirely. And finally, in 1910, the annexation treaty was signed under severe military duress. The Japanese military took direct colonial control of the peninsula.
And just like that, with the stroke of a pen and the presence of foreign bayonets, 518 years of continuous rule by the House of Yi, the grand, complex, highly structured, philosophically obsessive Joseon Dynasty was formally extinguished.
It is a profoundly sobering conclusion. But, as we step back and look at the massive scope of this history, the legacy of Joseon is impossible to overstate.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yes, the institutions ultimately failed to adapt to the brutal realities of 20th century imperialism. But consider the astounding historical fact that this dynasty lasted over 500 years. It survived the horrific trauma of the Imjin War, the humiliation of the Manchu invasions, and centuries of fierce, deadly internal factionalism.
And the cultural DNA they engineered, that Neo-Confucian software update we talked about, is still the bedrock of Korean identity today. You look at modern Korea with all its high-tech brilliance, and you see the legacy of Joseon everywhere.
Everywhere you look.
The Hangul alphabet, King Sejong's brilliant creation, survived centuries of aristocratic scorn to become the reason Korea has one of the highest literacy rates in the world today. The minimalist aesthetics of that pure white porcelain still heavily influence modern Korean art and design.
Very true.
Even the deep-seated cultural norms of respecting elders, of using complex honorifics in speech, of valuing education and academic credentials above almost everything else, the meticulous drive for institutional record-keeping, it all flows straight down the centuries from the Joseon court.
The state collapsed, but the cultural framework proved incredibly resilient. It survived the trauma of colonization, the devastation of the Korean War, and the division of the peninsula, shaping the vibrant, complex, modern society that thrives there today.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a lingering, provocative question to mull over. We saw how the severe trauma of the Japanese and Manchu invasions forced Joseon into a rigid, traumatized isolationism, sparking centuries of inward-looking factionalism. So imagine a different historical timeline.
Oh, what if?
Yeah. If the Joseon dynasty had never faced the unimaginable civilization-breaking devastation of the Imjin and Manchu invasions, if they had been allowed to develop in peace, trading with their neighbors without fear, would they have naturally evolved into a modernized constitutional monarchy on their own terms? Or was their incredibly rigid, hierarchical Neo-Confucian operating system always destined to crack and shatter under the crushing weight of the modern world?
It is one of the most profound historical what-ifs in East Asian history.
Next time you see footage of the neon skyline of Seoul, or if you are lucky enough to walk those streets yourself, look for the sweeping, curved wooden roofs of the palaces hiding in the center of it all. And remember the 500 years of blood, brilliance, philosophical obsession, and tragedy that built the very ground it stands on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking beneath the surface.